Hi there, good afternoon, nice to see you all. I hope you're staying safe and well. Welcome to another lesson on George Orwell's Animal Farm. In today's lesson we are looking at Chapter 7, and we're looking at the totalitarian nature of Animal Farm at this point in the novel, the increased use of violence and fear to control the animal population, and we're looking at essentially the growth of the cult of personality being built around the pig Napoleon, as the title suggested. We'll start by looking at the allegory behind the chapter, so we'll look at some of the key events that take place in this chapter and explain to you the allegory behind them. Then we'll be considering some of the language techniques and narrative structures that Orwell uses in this chapter, because I think this is a particularly interesting chapter structurally. If we go back to the beginning lessons, when I showed you Freytag's pyramid and I showed you the narrative arc, how he uses structure in this chapter and how certain ideas are repeated is particularly interesting from a structural perspective, so I'll be discussing those in the second part of the lesson. So let's start by looking at the allegory. Before we start, just again a plea and a reminder, please make sure you've read the chapter beforehand. It will help you to pass the quizzes. It will be much more useful for all of us if you've read the chapters beforehand. And make sure, again, as always, you're taking notes and completing your independent tasks after the lesson. Let's start with the allegory, and I'll go in kind of chronological order as always. I'll use lots of images to help to explain what's happened in this chapter, and then we'll move on to the second half of the lesson. The first thing to take note of in terms of the allegory used in this chapter, or the use of allegory in this chapter, is the framing device. The chapter begins with a reference to the bitter winter that's taking place across Animal Farm, and I've got an image of a Russian winter on your screens to illustrate what the allegory is about. This is an allegory for the kind of mass starvation and famine that took place in Russia under Stalin in the 30s, the food shortages that took place. And Orwell kind of uses the pathetic fallacy of the bitter winter and the stormy weather at the beginning of the chapter to create an atmosphere of suffering and misery and hostility that essentially develops as the chapter progresses. It worsens essentially as the chapter progresses. So that's the most significant part of the allegory at the beginning of the chapter, this use of the weather, which reminds us of the harsh Russian winters, which of course the Russian people experience every year due to their climate. That leads me on to page 55 and the reference to the food shortages, and this is something that took place. This happened a lot under Stalin, and millions of people died of famine under Stalin and under his policies. It links back to the lesson we talked about in terms of Russian history and his 5-year plans. Remember those 5-year plans and plans such as collectivization, which was the stripping of individual farms, creating collective farms, which were used to feed the growing urban population. These hugely transformative policies, these policies that put a lot of pressure on the peasants, actually caused famine because they didn't have enough food to feed themselves, because so much of their food was going to these new industrial urban cities. So in Animal Farm, the famine takes place and the food shortages starts to take place on page 55. And what's interesting in terms of the allegory is how the pigs choose to deal with it, and they choose to deal with the food shortages by concealing it. And this goes back to our previous lesson on totalitarian states. It's important that the pigs, rather than admitting to food shortages, rather than being honest about it, they choose to conceal this fact from the outside world. That's the quote from page 55. And even though there are lots of rumours spreading outside in other farms about Animal Farm and the starvation of the animals, they choose to conceal the fact that they're actually starving and to pretend that they're not, which is really important and links to the next part of the allegory I'll discuss. We've discussed this before, but Mr. Whymper, who is the solicitor who the animals deal with, he's an allegory for those kind of Western countries who used trade with the Soviet Union to kind of make money and essentially to profit from the Soviet Union. And in the chapter, Napoleon orders the empty food bins to be filled with sand in order to conceal the starvation of the animals from the outside world. And this is very much an allegory for how the Soviet Union and how the state in Russia and in the Soviet Union would choose to deliberately conceal facts from the outside world that were negative about the Soviet Union and life under Stalin. So they would conceal news about the peasants starving. They would deliberately suppress news about purges. And this took place all the way through the Soviet period up until 1990 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So the Soviet state was incredibly secretive and only allowed certain news to leave the Soviet Union and reach the Western world. And this is very much linked to the starvation and famine that took place in the 1930s in the Soviet Union and how Stalin tried to cover it up. So that's the allegory there, with Napoleon choosing to fill up these store grains. That's clearly based on what took place in Russia in the 1930s. The next thing I'd like to talk about briefly is how Napoleon in the early stage of the chapter is clearly still developing and honing this cult of personality that he's established. This idea that he's become a dictator and Animal Farm is essentially a dictatorship. And he only appears, it says on page 56, in a ceremonial manner with an escort of 6 dogs. So he's kind of seen and not heard. He's a figurehead. And he's becoming more and more reclusive, more and more secretive, and having less and less to do with the actual animals on the farm. And it's about, again, giving this impression to the other animals of being fearful, being strong, being powerful. And this, of course, links to Stalin and how Stalin cultivated this cult of personality, which we've talked about in previous lessons, how he cultivated this idea of being a leader who was feared and aggressive and powerful. Okay, the next event I'd like to discuss is one of the most significant, and I'm sure when you were reading you found this particularly shocking. It's the Hen Rebellion on page 56, in which the hens it's the first example of any dissent at all since the animals rebelled against Farmer Jones. And the hens rebel, let's just remind ourselves, they rebel because Napoleon comes up with a scheme to sell their eggs to raise money for the farm in order to rebuild the windmill. And it's really important to remember that this, of course, breaks one of the key commandments of animalism that old Major proposed, which is that you shouldn't act like a human being. You shouldn't, and all animals are equal. So the idea that Napoleon can take the labour of the hens, take their children, and sell them on to other farmers, again, it emphasises this idea that Napoleon is slowly becoming more and more human-like, more and more Jones-like, and of course by doing that he is of course betraying the principles of the rebellion. So the rebellion is being betrayed slowly but surely, and then I would say this chapter there is a kind of climax of betrayal, and of course what I mean by that is that this is the chapter in which for the first time in the novel another animal is killed by another animal. So it's the first time that they break that very important commandment about the animals not being able to kill one another, because of course that would mean they were acting in a way that was like Farmer Jones. And it's a particularly brutal execution. They are punished by death for their rebellion, and then I'll read the quote out. The dogs saw to it that these orders were carried out. For 5 days the hens held out. Then they capitulated and went back to their nesting boxes. 9 hens had died in the meantime. Their bodies were buried in the orchard, and it was given out that they had died of coccidiosis. Whymper heard nothing of this affair, and the eggs were duly delivered. What's important is that they die of starvation, and again it's a link. And this is an image of the Peasant Rebellion that took place in the 1930s. Again, these are wealthier peasants rebelling against the idea of their farms being taken away from them. So again, there's a clear allegorical link to the Hens Rebellion. These are linked to actual events that took place in Russia and actual rebellions that Stalin faced. And you'll notice that each time there is a rebellion against Stalin, or against Napoleon, he crushes that rebellion with violence very quickly. It becomes a trend throughout the novel. Here to this event, and I'll show you the image on the board. So to be absolutely clear, the Hen Rebellion is an example of foreshadowing, and it marks a very dark moment in the chapter, or a dark chapter in the story of Animal Farm, because now we can see these commandments that old Major prophesized about and envisioned. They're being slowly corrupted, they're being slowly betrayed, and things in terms of the structure of the novel and the patterns that you'll notice, things are gradually recurring. They're gradually returning to what they were like in chapter 1. And we call that a kind of cyclical narrative. So there's a cycle going on here. And what's important to say about the cyclical narrative, it's not history repeating itself exactly, as it were, but what is happening with this rebellion and this revolution is that it's actually creating a society that's even more oppressive, even more violent, even more fearful, even more totalitarian than the society under Farmer Jones. So again, it links to what happened in Russia with Stalinism and life under Stalin being even worse, even more severe, even more miserable than life was like under Tsar Nicholas II. Starting to embrace aspects of his leadership and starting to herald the Soviet Union as a country that was one to imitate, one to admire. And of course, Orwell is clearly writing against that. He's more knowledgeable about the crushing and oppressive nature of the Soviet Union. He's more aware about the totalitarian state that is Stalin's Russia, and he's warning us not to fall for Stalin, not to believe in the Stalin myth, but to question Stalin's Russia and to question whether or not the United Kingdom should become a country that looks up to such an oppressive regime. So it's really worth thinking about why Orwell is writing and what he's writing about at this point. Moving on slightly, and again going back to this theme of totalitarianism, the next aspect of the allegory that's worth discussing is again the treatment of Snowball. And there's a kind of parallel going on here. Just as Napoleon on the one hand is being developed into this cult of personality, godlike figure, who the animals worship and idolize. On the other hand, Snowball is becoming their scapegoat. He's becoming the hate figure. He's becoming the fictional enemy that the animals can direct their hatred towards. And it's important thinking about why would they need Snowball to be the hate figure? Why do they need Snowball to be the scapegoat? Well, it's because they can blame everything that goes wrong on the farm on Snowball. They don't have to take any accountability at all. They don't have to take any responsibility. Everything can be heaped on Snowball and blamed on him. And of course, we know that the destruction of the windmill was blamed on Snowball. And in chapter 7, Napoleon creates this myth that he's been visiting the farm at night. He's been hiding in he's taken shelter in the rival farms. That he's visiting Mr. Pilkington at Pinchfield. So all of these kind of myths are being created. He's upsetting the milk pails. He's breaking eggs. He's gnawing the bark of the trees. And the reason that Napoleon is doing this, the reason that the pigs are creating this fictional enemy for the animals, is firstly to direct their hatred and their blame towards Snowball rather than the leadership of the farm, but also to direct their to create a sense of fear. And we know that that's how totalitarian regimes remain in power. They create fear amongst their subjects. And to speak about the allegory, we've talked about this before, but this goes back to the allegory of Trotsky and how Trotsky was treated as an enemy and treated as a threat by Stalin, and how he would spread propaganda about Trotsky trying to undermine the Soviet Union from abroad, from exile. So that's the allegory there, that Snowball represents Trotsky and how Trotsky was treated as a public enemy number one by the Soviet state. And the event that takes place that's particularly significant in this chapter in regards to the creation of a common enemy for the animals is that Squealer attempts to rewrite history. He attempts to retell the Battle of the Cowshed and try to persuade the animals that in fact Snowball was on the side of the other farmers the entire time, and he was actually an undercover agent for Farmer Jones. And this is an example of censorship. I'll show you an image just to remind ourselves of the features of a totalitarian state. But what Squealer is doing here is clearly rewriting history and trying to change the collective memory of the animals. And we'll talk about why he's doing that in a second. But let's have a look at those features of tyranny just to remind ourselves. Okay, so I've talked a lot about bullet point number 3, but I'm actually going to talk a bit about the final bullet point, the censorship one, and the penultimate one, the spreading of false information. Why do totalitarian states do that? It's because it's essentially part of the process of brainwashing that often takes place in totalitarian states. Again, these points are often interrelated, but bullet point 4, no freedom of speech or thought. That's how these totalitarian states remain in control, remain in power. They spread false information, they brainwash their citizens to believe in their lies, and they edit both, ideas. They censor novels, they censor plays, they censor films, and they spread and edit messages that suit their purposes. So you wouldn't in the Soviet Union be able to read anything that was critical of the Soviet Union. All books or articles that were written that were critical of the Soviet Union were censored or banned. And this is kind of a link to that in terms of what happens in chapter 7. The allegory here is that Squealer represents Molotov and the propaganda artists that helped to run the Soviet state, and they are rewriting history. They're editing the memories of the animals. They're brainwashing them to become more compliant and more obedient. Okay, we've reached a checkpoint. Your timing suggestions are on the board alongside the questions I'd like to answer. Please make sure you're writing in full sentences, and I'll see you shortly. Welcome back. I'm still discussing the allegorical significance of chapter 7. We're about halfway through. I'm going to briefly talk about what takes place on page 61. And this is the pig Napoleon, of course, the leader of Animal Farm. And I'll read out the very short description that I want to talk about. Napoleon emerged from the farmhouse wearing both his medals, for he had recently awarded himself Animal Hero First Class and Animal Hero Second Class, with his 9 huge dogs frisking around him and uttering growls that sent shivers down all the animals' spines. And it's important on an allegorical level that the character of Napoleon has firstly, he's awarded himself medals that he doesn't deserve. That's the thing we should be thinking firstly. Remember, he didn't actually. He was nowhere to be seen in either of the battles that have taken place so far. So the idea that he can award himself with a medal for bravery is obviously ironic. And this is an example again. We talked about how Animal Farm, in terms of its form, it is a dystopia. It's a parable. It's in some senses a fable, but we have to remember that it's also a satire. So this is a biting satire. This is clearly Orwell mocking Stalin, and I'll show you a picture of Stalin, and I'll explain how Orwell is mocking him. Okay, so here's an image of Stalin. It's a propaganda painting that I've shown you many times now throughout these tutorials, but notice what he's wearing. He's wearing the uniform of a general, even though he has no qualifications in that field. He's not a military man, Stalin. The point of what I'm trying to make here is that Orwell is clearly making fun of and mocking Stalin for how he presented himself, or how he presents himself in 1945 as being a military genius, as being a military figure, when he in fact isn't at all. So Orwell is clearly mocking Stalin for how Stalin perceives himself. So it's clearly an example of satire. I'm next going to discuss the scene that is absolutely the most harrowing of the entire novel so far, and that is the scene of the confessions of the animals and the massacre that takes place. So I'm going to read this scene first, and then we'll discuss it in more detail. So I'm going to start from the bottom of page 61, the final paragraph. Presently the tumult died down. The 4 pigs waited, trembling, with guilt written on every line of their countenances. Napoleon was called upon them to confess their crimes. They were the same 4 pigs as had protested when Napoleon abolished the Sunday meetings. Without any further prompting, they confessed that they had already been secretly in touch with Snowball ever since his expulsion, that they had collaborated with him in destroying the windmill, and that they had entered into an agreement with him to hand over Animal Farm to Mr. Frederick. They added that Snowball had privately admitted to them that he had been Mr. Jones's secret agent for years past. When they had finished their confessions, the dog promptly tore their throats out, and in a terrible voice, Napoleon demanded whether any other animal had anything to confess. The three hens who had been the ringleaders in the attempted rebellion over the eggs now came forward and stated that Snowball had appeared to them in a dream and incited them to disobey Napoleon's orders. They too were slaughtered. Then a goose came forward and confessed having secreted 6 ears of corn during the last year's winter harvest, and eaten them in the night. Then a sheep confessed having urinated in the drinking pool, urged to do this, so she said, by Snowball, and 2 other sheep confessed having murdered an old ram, an especially devoted follower of Napoleon, by chasing him round and round a bonfire when he was suffering from a cough. They were all slain on the spot, and so the tale of confessions and executions went on, until there was a pile of corpses lying around and before Napoleon's feet, and the air was heavy with the smell of blood, which had been unknown there since the expulsion of Jones. When it was all over, the animals, except for the pigs and dogs, crept away in a body. They were shaken and miserable. So this event, of course, marks the darkest chapter in Animal Farm so far, and it's, of course, a deeply traumatic and brutal chapter in which we see just how oppressive, violent, and dictatorial Napoleon has become. That image that we're left with at the end of that scene with the bodies piled before Napoleon is deeply profound, deeply shocking, and deeply upsetting. It's important that this scene marks that betrayal of the revolution, the idea that no other animal shall kill any other animal. That commandment has clearly been broken. And I'm sure many of you noticed the kind of there's a strange element to this idea of these odd confessions, these animals suddenly and spontaneously confessing to committing crimes like, supporting Snowball, or chasing an old ram to death, or urinating in the drinking pool. These confessions are clearly caused by absolute terror. And I think when we read this, we have to be very careful and not necessarily believe that the animals who confess these crimes have actually committed the crimes. I would suggest to you that the 4 pigs who confessed their crimes about working with Snowball, the sheep that confesses his crime to urinating in the pool, these confessions are prompted by fear, and they are in all likelihood completely fictional, so they didn't really happen. And you might be thinking, well, how on earth or why on earth would someone confess to a crime that they did not commit? But it's a very powerful scene, I think, because I think the atmosphere of this scene is one of absolute terror, and you have to imagine the animals in a situation where the terror has kind of created what we would call a collective hysteria, and by that I mean a sense of almost a nervous breakdown amongst the animals, and the fear itself is what propels them to admit their guilt. So that's how I read it. I think it's very much a chapter that explores the consequences of such a fear, and there's such a terror in Animal Farm that animals are now confessing to crimes that they did not themselves commit. Let's now look at the allegory behind this. And this scene is clearly an allegory for the Great Purge, which is also known as the Great Terror, and I'll give you some time to read the information on the screen, and you'll hear my voice shortly. And on your screens is an image of a show trial, and the defendant is already, it's called a show trial for a reason. The defendant has no real trial. It's merely designed as a kind of public display of guilt, and these show trials took place in their thousands. And it's significant that it's the 4 pigs who immediately are the first to admit their guilt. And this links to how Stalin purged his own party. He purged the Bolsheviks. He got rid of his own colleagues, some of the revolutionaries who helped to launch and oversee the Russian Revolution. And I always show my students this photograph and how you can see it changes. You have the photograph where I can't remember his name, but one of Stalin's colleagues is to his left, and then in the next photo, the Soviet state have edited that photo so that he's no longer there. And these show trials were obviously used, firstly, to show support for the state. Again, it's an example of brainwashing, but also, of course, to spread fear, because it shows you the consequences for getting in Stalin's way. So this is obviously a moral stain on the Soviet Union. And again, we have to remember that Orwell is writing a fierce criticism of Stalin and Stalinism. And of course, remembering that this is taking place in 1945 when Stalin is seen as being kind of a saviour, Orwell is reminding us that this society is built upon, is built on the blood of political prisoners, of those who've been purged and executed for crimes that they didn't even commit. And that's the kind of the horror of the scene, is that these animals in animal farm are being slaughtered for crimes that they did not commit, which links to the thousands upon thousands of murders and executions that took place during the Great Terror and the Great Purges. And of course, this is a strong criticism against totalitarianism. It's clearly warning us about the consequences of a totalitarian state and a ruler who has absolute power. And of course, it goes without saying that image I spoke about earlier of the pile of corpses lying before Napoleon's feet and the air being heavy with the smell of blood. That description is clearly an allegory based on the blood spilt by Joseph Stalin during the Great Terror and the Great Purges and the millions of Russians who were killed. So it's an incredibly strong piece of writing. Finally, I'd like to discuss the description that takes place in terms of the animal's reaction to these events. And I'll talk about this more in the structural aspects of the lesson. But what's important is that this represents the misery and the suffering of the Russian people. When they gather on that knoll and all the animals huddle around Clover on page 63, this represents the suffering of the Russian people and the eventual realization that life under Joseph Stalin and the system that replaced communism, known as Stalinism, was actually worse than life under Farmer Jones. And it's significant that when they sit beside Clover and we get a beautiful piece of writing which describes what she would be thinking if she could think. This idea that she wouldn't have gone through all of this for such a terrible society. She would never have rebelled in the first place. Essentially, what's significant about this is when they are singing "Beasts of England," and we know that "Beasts of England" initially was a song of victory. At the end of the chapter, on page 64 and 65, "Beast of England" becomes a funeral song. It becomes what's called a dirge, and they sing it kind of to comfort themselves. And then, ironically, they're banned from singing it because a new song has been written, which is essentially a song praising Napoleon. So it's again an emphasis on Stalinism taking over from communism. So at the end of the chapter, the allegory really is that this rebellion that took place in chapter 1, or chapter 2 rather, of the animals has been completely betrayed and completely corrupted, and it's become meaningless. And essentially by the end of chapter 7 we are absolutely sure that this society is now a dictatorship and a totalitarian state, and that's the allegory of this chapter, this idea that this rebellion has now lost its purpose, lost its way, and been totally and utterly corrupted. Okay, we've reached another checkpoint. Your questions are on the screen. Again, please write in full sentences. You've also got your timings on the screen as well. Please pause the video and I'll see you shortly. I just wanted to end by discussing the narrative structure, which we have talked about throughout this lesson, but I just wanted to consolidate on this. This chapter represents the kind of climax, the nadir, I suppose, of Animal Farm so far in the evolution of the rebellion, and it's now gone basically full cycle, and that's the word I want to kind of finish on, this idea of a cycle, the idea of history repeating itself, but actually getting worse. This is a cycle that's been repeated, but actually Stalinism is worse than feudalism under Tsar Nicholas II. So too is Napoleon's reign worse than Tsar Nicholas II, than Farmer Jones's reign. So there's a cyclical element to this chapter. It returns full circle, and you have even kind of subtle things like the way in which all the animals huddle around Clover. Many of you might have recognised it being a very similar description to what takes place in chapter 1 when she uses her foreleg to kind of shelter the smaller animals. You may have noticed another cyclical element to it, which is the singing of Beasts of England, just like what took place in chapter 1. Only this time they sing it 3 times, but they sing it mournfully, and it's then banned forever. You may have noticed the cyclical element to Farmer Jones firing the gun in chapter 1, and that being worsened and history repeating itself with Napoleon using the dogs as his weapon, and the dogs tearing the throats out of the animals. So there are lots of events in this novel, and in this chapter rather, that actually kind of harken back to what took place earlier on in the novel, but only the events that take place in this chapter are even worse than the events that took place earlier. So we could say there's a cyclical element to this. There's certainly, as we talked about earlier, the framing of the chapter by the use of pathetic fallacy. That's used throughout to create that ominous, foreboding atmosphere that things are going to get even worse on the farm. And of course we have this huge amount of sudden tension when the animals actually confess their crimes. So I think when we end on those words, in the final words of the chapter, somehow neither the words nor the tune ever seemed to the animals to come up to Beasts of England. So the song that's replacing Beasts of England never quite replaces the sentiment. So what I would end on is that even though I've said that this is a cyclical chapter in which actually history repeats itself and things get even worse, there is a glimmer of hope offered by Orwell in that description. So the fact that the song that replaces Beasts of England never lives up to the original song gives us some degree of hope that things might get better in the future. So that is the end of today's lesson. And please now make sure you complete your independent tasks and the quizzes that I've set you. And I'll see you next time when we look at chapter 8. Stay safe and stay well.